Good afternoon. My name is James Mendelson. I am a senior lecturer in the Faculty of Business and Law. With me are Harry Sotnick-Hommel and Poppy Gordon, who are both students in the School of Health and Applied Science. Hello, Poppy. Hello, Harry.
Hi.
And we are going to be talking for the next hour or so about the topic of when inclusivity appears to fall through the gaps, the lived experiences of Jewish students at UWE. This is who we are. I am a senior lecturer in law in the Faculty of Business and Law. Harry is an undergraduate student doing psychology and criminology, and Poppy is an undergraduate doing paramedic science in the School of Health and Applied Sciences. And the thing we all have in common is that we are all Jewish members of the UWE community. And just as we start this presentation, here is something for you to think about if you are listening to us. A very simple question. When we talk about BAME students, as we have done a lot over the last year or so at UWE, do we include Jewish students within that? Why or why not? So I'll give you just a minute or so just to type some thoughts into the chat as you listen, and we will try to respond to those. Okay, thank you. I hope that's been a useful exercise just to get the ball rolling. This is where we're going to be heading over the next hour or so. We'll start with some definitions and some themes. We'll think about the question, do Jewish students count? The main part of this recording will be me interviewing Harry and Poppy about their lived experience as Jewish students, and then we'll finish off with some practical suggestions and resources. So to begin with, some definitions and themes. The phenomenon we're thinking about is antisemitism. So what is antisemitism? Antisemitism is racism directed against Jewish people. Anti-Jewish racism. It has its own word, which is anti-Semitism. Now, this is not a word which Jews ourselves invented. It was actually invented by a German man called Wilhelm Marr in the late 19th century as a scientific sounding alternative to the German word Judenhass, or Jew hate. Okay, he wanted a scientific sounding word as an alternative to that, and so he devised this term antisemitismus in German or antisemitism in English. So anti-Jewish racism. Now, antisemitism can be similar to other forms of racism, so it can be based on physical appearance or on supposed physical attributes, but it can also be distinct, for example, based on conspiracy theories about Jews. We'll look at that in a moment. Antisemitism is a very old phenomenon. You can trace it back to ancient times. It can come from anywhere on the political spectrum, right or left or centre, or indeed from people outside politics. And it can take different forms. Here are just some of the forms which anti-Semitism has taken over the centuries. It can take a religious form, for example, saying that all Jewish people are guilty of the death of Jesus, or describing Jews as devils. It can take a political form. So when Jews, for example, are excluded from serving in political office. It can take an institutional form when institutions or organisations exclude or discriminate against Jews. It can take a conspiratorial form. So this is the idea that there are conspiracy theories about Jews using our supposed money and influence and power for our own sinister ends. Sometimes anti-Semitism takes a racial form. So most obviously, the Nazis targeted Jewish people for annihilation based on our ancestry. Didn't matter what kind of Jew you were, what you believed. If you had Jewish ancestry, the Nazis would come after you. Anti-Semitism can take an economic form. So what I mean by that is boycotts of Jews or Jewish businesses. Nazi anti-Semitism is, I suspect, the one we all know about. There was also Soviet anti-Semitism, which probably fewer of us know about, but it's been influential on certain parts of the British political left. Holocaust denial is when people say that the Holocaust didn't take place or that it has been exaggerated. Holocaust inversion, a relatively modern form of anti-Semitism, is where Jews or Israel are said to be repeating or continuing the Holocaust. In other words, rather than being victims, they are inverted into perpetrators. That is called Holocaust inversion. And then finally, anti-Zionist anti-Semitism. This is where people think or talk about the state of Israel in ways which mirror the other forms of anti-Semitism that we've just mentioned. I'll just say that again. Anti-Zionist anti-Semitism is when people think or talk about the state of Israel in ways which mirror the other forms of anti-Semitism which we have just mentioned. Clearly, that doesn't mean that any sort of criticism of the government of Israel is anti-Semitic. Of course not. But there are some ways of thinking and talking about Israel which, depending on the wider context, may be anti-Semitic, and we'll look at those in just a moment. So various different forms of anti-Semitism, often, although not always, they overlap. And there have been a number of recurring themes over the centuries. Let's look at some of those. So recurring themes, you can sort of see these themes in anti-Semitic literature and propaganda through the ages. They're sometimes called tropes. A trope is a theme or an image that keeps on cropping up. So one of the recurring themes is the idea that Jews are Christ killers. Okay, that all Jews everywhere throughout all generations are guilty for the death of Jesus. Another is the blood libel. This is the idea that Jews in the Middle Ages were accused of killing Christian children and using their blood to make bread for Passover, which is one of the Jewish religious festivals. That's called the blood libel. The idea that Jews have lots of money, I wish, and use our money for sinister purposes. The idea that Jews have power over elected politicians. Again, I wish. I don't even have power to make my students read everything on the reading list, but Jews frequently have been accused of having power and using it in sinister ways. The idea that Jews control the media. The idea, which is connected to the above, that there is a Jewish or Israeli lobby which is all powerful and crushes opponents and sways elected governments and sways the media. That's a recurring theme. The idea that Jews are devils or pigs or apes or insects or snakes or vermin or rats or lice, that's a recurring theme. And a more recent theme is portraying Jews or Israel as Nazis. Once again, often, although not always, these themes will overlap. Here are a few examples. So this, to begin with, is the blood libel. This image comes from Germany in the 18th century, but I could have chosen other images. So at the top here, you can see a little Christian child who has been murdered by the Jews. Here are the Jews, these sinister people in black, One of them is riding a pig. I'm sure you all know that pigs are unclean or not kosher for Jews. Here's another one suckling from the pig, and here is the devil looking on. Okay, so the blood libel, the idea that Jews have killed a Christian child to use his blood for religious purposes. Jews and money. Okay, image about Jacob Rothschild, the Rothschild banking dynasty, how wealthy they supposedly are, the influence they supposedly have, the way in which they own the media, the government, and so on. Connected to that, the idea that Jews have power over elected politicians. So this is George Soros, a modern day wealthy Jew, and you can see this is an image that came from the Brexit campaign from Leave EU, and George Soros is shown to be the puppet master dangling David Lammy on a string and controlling him. George Soros is shown to be controlling him by means of his money. So the idea that Jews have power and money, which they use to subvert elected politicians and elected governments. Jewish controlled the media. Not sure where this meme comes from, but here you go. Lots and lots of media outlets which are said to be controlled by Jews. Jews as the centre of a global conspiracy. So there are two images here, quite similar. The first one, this one here on the left, a Jewish octopus with a Star of David above his head, spreading his tentacles over the entire globe. And the Jews are up to no good. And this is a Soviet version of that. So not an octopus this time, but something resembling a spider in the centre of a web. You can see the Star of David here. Rather than having Jew on its back, the creature has the word Zionism, which is the movement for Jewish self-determination. But the effect is pretty much the same, that Zionism or Jews are at the centre of all sorts of horrible things, which in this case are undermining the Soviet Union or communism. A few more of these. The association of Jews and the devil. So we've seen this image already, haven't we? The devil is on the scene as Jews murder a Christian child. That was from 18th century Germany. These other two images, they're very recent. They're from the last few weeks from anti-Israel protests. But you can see that Benjamin Netanyahu, the outgoing Israeli prime minister, is being portrayed as a devil. Okay, can you see that? There is a continuity in the imagery. He is also shown to be drinking blood here, and to be repeating the Holocaust, which is a Holocaust inversion. And just one more set of images, the modern trope of Jews or Israel as Nazis. So this image here on the left, this is Hitler. This is the former Israeli leader Ariel Sharon. This is an image from the Arab media, and Sharon is shown as continuing Hitler's work of slaughtering people. And here, this doesn't really need much explanation. There is a direct equivalence being drawn between the state of Israel and Nazi Germany. This is what is known as Holocaust inversion. So that's some background, that's an introduction to what we mean by anti-Semitism and some examples of how it has manifested itself over the centuries. We are going to move on and bring this hopefully right into our own experience and think about this question: do Jewish students count? Do Jewish students count, particularly here at UWE? So, to start us thinking off about this, let's think about racism in Bristol. When we think about racism in Bristol, we rightly talk about Bristol's connection with the slave trade. We rightly talk about the Bristol bus boycott. I wonder whether we talk about this in the same way. Do we talk about, are we even aware of how in 1183 Jews in Bristol were falsely accused of murdering a Christian child. That's the blood libel. Do we talk about what happened in 1210, which is when all Jewish householders in England were imprisoned in Bristol and fined? Do we talk about the physical attacks on Jews in Bristol in 1266 and 1275? Do we talk about how Jews were expelled from the whole of England by King Edward I in 1290 and not readmitted until 1656? And do we talk about what happened in 1754, which is when Parliament proposed various measures to make life easier for Jewish immigrants to become, Parliament wanted to make it easier for Jewish immigrants to become citizens. Here in Bristol, the merchant venturers, those are the same people who are linked to Colston and the slave trade, protested against that. Okay, so the last organised anti-Semitism in Bristol in 1754 was undertaken by the merchant venturers. Do we talk about that? If that all seems a long time ago, let's bring that up to date. This is from just 4 years ago, the 2017 general election. An anti-Semitic banner was hung right here in the Bear Pit in the centre of Bristol. You can see on one side of the banner, Jeremy Corbyn, and you can see on the other side of the banner, Theresa May, who has a Star of David earring. She is being portrayed as being in the service of or under the control of Jews. So this is one of the tropes we've looked at, one of the themes, the idea that Jews control elected politicians, elected governments. We rightly talk, don't we, about whether it is right to preserve or topple statues of slave traders. We rightly talk about whether it is right to name public buildings after them. I wonder whether we talk about this in the same way. This street sign is just up the road from French campus in Filton. It's not far away from where I live. It's a road named after Roald Dahl. There's a little area where all the streets are named after famous writers. This one is named after Roald Dahl. Why is that something worth mentioning? I hear you ask. The reason I mention it is because Roald Dahl was viciously anti-Semitic. This is something he said in 1983. He said, there is a trait in the Jewish character that does provoke animosity. Maybe it's a kind of lack of generosity towards non-Jews. I mean, there's always a reason why anti-anything crops up anywhere. Even a stinker like Hitler didn't just pick on them for no reason. That's just one of the anti-Semitic things that Roald Dahl said. Can you see what he was doing there? He was saying that Jews were in some way responsible for what Hitler did to them. He is victim blaming. He is blaming Jews for what happened to them at the hands of Hitler. Do we talk about that? I wonder. My guess is we don't. That's not unique to UWE. I think it's a wider phenomenon that people who seek to oppose racism maybe don't think about anti-Semitism in the same way as they do other forms of racism. David Baddiel, the comedian, has written a whole book about that, titled Jews Don't Count. And he proposes some reasons as to why that might be the case. We're going to think about a few of them. The first, I think, is very simply there aren't that many of us. Okay, in Britain, there are about 300,000, mainly in London and Manchester, about 0.3% of the total population, which means that most British people don't know many Jews, or if they do, probably don't know them very well. Here in Bristol, in the 2011 census, there were fewer than 800 Jews, which is about 0.2% of the city's population. Here at UWE, 12 Jewish students enrolled in 2018-19. There were 10 Jewish staff in December 2019. I joined in January 2020, so I guess that figure has now gone up to 11. But as with the wider country and as with the city, most people at UWE probably won't know any Jewish people or if they do, might not know them very well. So that's one reason. Another reason is a lot of people aren't necessarily sure on whether Jews are a religious group or an ethnic group. And that's understandable because there is a religion, Judaism, but not all Jewish people practice it. And non-Jews can convert to Judaism and become Jewish. On the other hand, Jews are recognised as an ethnic group, not just a religious group, but an ethnic group in English law. I'm a law lecturer, so here is the case which says that, the case of Mandler and Dowley, that's a 1982 case, which recognised Jews as an ethnic group, not just a religious group. Are Jews white? Okay, that's quite an important question to think about, because when we think about racism, often perhaps we think about white people and we think about BAME people. Where do Jews fit into that? Most Jewish people in Britain have white skin. Not all, there are black Jews, which is quite important, but most Jews in Britain have white skin. On the other hand, we are within living memory of 6 million Jews being murdered for not being white enough. According to the Nazis, the ideal was to be a white, blonde-haired Aryan, and the antithesis, the opposite of that, was a rather dark-featured Jew. So are Jews white? Okay, that is something worth thinking about. Let's think also about UWE's catchment area. A lot of our students come from the southwest or Wales or Cornwall, and those are parts of the country with very few Jews. So what that means is that many of our students will meet Jewish people for the first time when they come to UWE. And then maybe many at UWE who don't know much about Jewish stuff beyond what they've learned in history or RE in school, or beyond what they see in the media and in popular culture. How are Jewish people portrayed in popular culture? Well, here are a few examples. We are portrayed as being religious, or we are portrayed as being white, and there's not much sort of variation on that. Whereas in reality, Jewish life is very broad, it's very diverse. All of these people in this on this slide are Jewish, and as you can see, variety of different a whole variety of expressions of Jewish life. The footballer, just in case you're wondering, this is Joe Jacobson, one of the very few Jewish players to play professionally in the Football League. He had a spell with Bristol Rovers, as you can see. More importantly, he later went on to play for Shrewsbury Town, for whom he played 119 times and scored 7 goals. I just thought I should mention that. That might give you a clue as to who I support. But Jewish life in reality, very broad, very diverse. That's enough of me talking, really. I'm now going to ask Poppy to turn their cameras back on. So come back in, Poppy.
Hiya.
Hello there. All is Poppy. So Poppy, first of all, just tell me, please, where you're from, a little bit about your background, and maybe about what being Jewish means to you.
Yeah, so I'm Poppy. I'm from North London and I grew up there. I moved to Bristol almost 2 years ago to come study here. I'm a Reformed Jew, non-practicing, and essentially what being Reformed means is it's just a more modern branch of Judaism, and it incorporates some of the more modern traditions and adapted the practices to it. I think in terms of being Jewish, I wasn't intact with it at all until I joined the Jewish secondary school, and I was starting to be surrounded by people with the same beliefs and same upbringing as me, and that was really new and exciting, and to have that connection with people and that sense of community, I think has been really important to me since a young age.
Okay, so that's back home, and just tell us, did you go to Jewish schools?
Yeah, so I joined the Jewish school for secondary school, and I stayed there until sixth form, and yeah, I learned a lot about it and met a lot of Jews. And yeah.
Okay, and just tell us, outside school, would you be involved in, I don't know, maybe Jewish youth clubs, that kind of stuff?
I wasn't involved in any youth clubs in particular, but my circle of friends was almost exclusively Jewish, and went to a lot of bar bat mitzvahs and things like that.
Okay, so bar bat mitzvahs, just for those who don't know, that's a ceremony that Jewish teenagers go through. So home, you're in a Jewish environment, you're in a Jewish school, you're used to being surrounded by lots and lots of Jewish people. What made you choose UWE, which is very different to that?
So I think Bristol is a very, very, very culturally diverse city, with lots of people from lots of different backgrounds. And I think coming from an ethnic minority myself, I thought that would be appreciated here and welcomed. And yeah, I think it is to an extent still. I just think I was quite naive coming out of London, to the extent of which there aren't actually that many Jews out of London, and how much minority we actually are.
Okay, yeah. So that sort of leads. So what made you choose? So So explain why you chose UWE. What were your expectations?
I think I was very, very naive in the sense I didn't really have any expectations. I think growing up in North London and being surrounded by Jews, I didn't really recognise us as a minority exactly. And then coming to UWE, it was a bit of a smack in the face, really, to the extent I was the first Jew that 99% of people had met. And I found that really interesting. There were good conversations and bad conversations which came along with that. But I think overall it's been probably a positive experience, I'd say.
Okay, so maybe just expand on that. What would you say have been some of the positive experiences?
So last year when I was in halls, I was with a bunch of girls who I didn't know previously and hadn't met a Jewish person before. And there were conversations we had which they were eager to learn and just wanted to know more. And I remember having quite a nice conversation with them actually at the start of the year when we all moved in about me being kosher, which essentially being kosher is like dietary law in Judaism. And me essentially saying, you're welcome to use my cutlery and my plates and whatnot, but please not for certain things if that's okay, because I am Jewish.
Okay, and were they respectful of that?
Yeah, they were all really accommodating of that, which was really nice. Even if they didn't fully understand it, they were happy to comply, which was lovely.
That's good. And tell me, have you met any other Jewish people while you're here?
Yeah, so funnily enough, on my cohort of about 50, there is another Jewish person from North London, which was really surprising and really nice as well to have, I guess, a little piece of home and someone along my journey with me on my course who is from the same background and upbringing as me. So that was really nice.
Okay, that's good. So that's positive, and you've had some positive experiences with your housemates. Have you had any negative experiences or anything that's been challenging?
Yeah, so I think a lot of the conversations and comments I've had about looking Jewish and anti-Semitic tropes have come from people's only exposure to Jews being from the media. And I think often a lot of the media people are watching, which contains Jews and Jewish characters, isn't written by Jews and therefore can become slightly dodgy and almost steer into anti-Semitic tropes. So I remember seeing on telly a bit ago a scene in Grey's Anatomy where there's this Orthodox Jew who needs a donor of some sort for a transplant, and the only donor available was a Muslim lady. And obviously this is all dramatized, and he's like, no, I'm not having this donation because it's from a woman and she's Muslim. And I think that was just creating aggravation and just also entirely incorrect, and yeah, just fueling fire really. And if people, that's all they're seeing, they're not going to have a good thought of Orthodox Jews at all, and therefore the rest of the community.
Yeah, thank you. So that's actually one of the images that I included on the slide earlier on about how Jews are portrayed in the media. So the programme was Grey's Anatomy, is that right?
Yeah, I believe so.
Yeah. So there's a scene in Grey's Anatomy where a Jewish family, an Orthodox Jewish family, so they're the ones with the black hats, need an organ donor. The only donor available is an Arab woman or a Muslim woman, and the father of this Orthodox Jewish family is portrayed as being against, being very upset with the prospect of accepting an organ from a Muslim lady. So Jews are being portrayed as being prejudiced or hostile to others, which is a trope, a theme. So that came up. Any other negative experiences? Perhaps give us a flavour of the sort of comments you've received.
Yeah, so lots of comments being like, you don't look Jewish. I'm sure you
whatever that means.
Big noses, big curly hair, things like that, which, I mean, I can't talk with a hair right now, but, you know, things like that.
Hair gets curly when it's longer.
Yeah. And comments about money, obviously people assuming I'm rich because I'm Jewish and I'm stingy and things like that, which are hard to play off, especially like when you're meeting new people and people are coming in with these preconceptions about you.
So that presumably is from people you live with, maybe people on your course.
Yeah, people I've met at UWE.
Yeah. What about in the classroom itself? So during your teaching, any sort of experiences, either positive or negative, you'd like to share?
Yeah, so not so many experiences in the classroom generally, but obviously we've done a module on inclusivity and stuff within the ambulance service, and we've talked about different minorities. No mention of Jewish people whatsoever within that, and it's, I don't know, it's quite difficult watching that as a Jew and being like, well, we do actually exist.
Yeah.
High, but yeah.
Okay, so a whole module which talks about inclusivity and minorities, but doesn't make any mention of Jewish people or antisemitism. Okay, yeah, and that chimes with some of my own experiences as I look at some of the material on inclusivity at UWE. There's very little about antisemitism or Jewish people, so that's sort of worth highlighting. Now, Poppy, as I'm sure you're aware, as I'm sure people listening will be aware, over the last few weeks there has been fighting in the Middle East between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, and I don't particularly want to talk about what's happening over there, but just give us a flavour. How has it felt over here? How has it felt for you as a Jewish person in England, in Bristol, in UWE over the last few weeks?
Yeah, I think a lot of the Jewish people I know around the UK, in London, in Bristol here, I think we're all uneasy, we're all feeling unsafe, and I think I'm finding that personally really difficult at the moment, being out of London where my family is, my Jewish community is, and being in Bristol where I only know a handful of other Jewish people. And I think as well as that, a lot of the stuff I've been seeing on social media is really scary to read, actually. People are getting their information from infographics rather than doing their own research. And a lot of these infographics are summing up a decades-old conflict in just a few sentences with some pretty pictures. And there was one in particular going around which a lot of people I follow shared, essentially saying the whole conflict was linked around oil within Israel, and that it was all being controlled by a Rothschild family, who you previously mentioned in your PowerPoint.
Right.
And it was, the whole infographic per se was just anti-Semitic. There wasn't really much to say about it apart from it was just anti-Semitic.
Okay, so one of the tropes I mentioned at the start was the Rothschilds and the idea that Jews use their money for nefarious ends, and it sounds like Poppy has encountered a modern version of that. And that is very easy. It's very show that that's false, because the only bit of the Middle East without oil is Israel. Okay, so that infographic can be disproven within a few, within moments, but nonetheless, seeing it widely shared made you feel uneasy.
Yeah, people are seeing what they see online and taking it without thinking, really. So.
And that has an impact, even though that's about, or at least nominally about, a conflict thousands of miles away. That has an impact on you.
Yeah.
Yeah. That also is something I can relate to. I've lived in England almost all my life. I'm 44. The last few weeks are the first time I felt scared to be Jewish in Britain. And I also know lots of Jewish people who would say that. Poppy, just before we move over to Harry, some of the people listen to this will be lecturers, they might be people who teach you. What is the one thing you would like them to take away from this recording?
Don't assume you don't have any Jewish students in your class. We exist. We're here.
Yeah.
There might not be a lot of us, but we are here. And I think we need to be accommodated to. And I think, I don't know about Harry, but especially at the moment, I'm feeling incredibly stressed about what the rise in anti-Semitism. And my academic work isn't at its best because of it. It's a lot of pressure on all of us at the moment. And I think throughout there will be different pressures on us just from being Jewish. So I think recognise we're here and accommodate to that would be lovely. So.
Sure. Yeah, no, thank you. That's a good summary. For those who are listening, we've been thinking a lot at UWE about the awarding gap. So Jewish people, Jewish students, generally there won't be an awarding gap issue. Jewish students tend to perform pretty well, but just because there's an awarding gap issue, that doesn't mean we don't face particular challenges. Certainly, I think if I was a Jewish student right now, I would be feeling pretty anxious about one way or another, and that might well affect my academic work. Okay, great, thank you. Do you want to swap places with Harry then?
Yes, I will do.
Hi, James.
Hi, Harry. Okay, so we've heard from Poppy. Now we're going to hear from Harry. As you can see, we've done this in a socially distanced manner, so one student after another. So Harry, I'll ask you the same question I asked Poppy. Just tell us first of all where you're from, a little bit about your background and what being Jewish means to you.
So I'm from outer North London, and I'm a non-religious Orthodox Jew. So this means the branch of Judaism that I follow is usually more strict with its adherences and observances to what's traditional. So a religious Orthodox Jew may not use electronics over Friday night to Saturday afternoon while it's the Sabbath. And being Jewish, for me, it's an ethnic and religious identity, and it includes a lot of good food and having kindness and compassion for people who need it. It often involves celebrating a time when someone tried to kill us and then having a big meal with family over it.
Okay, yeah, so that's a good working summary of a lot of Jewish festivals. It's when we remember someone trying to kill us, God delivers us, and then we have a good meal. Okay, so you're from North London, you're from a Orthodox family, maybe not personally that observant. Just tell us about growing up. Were you at Jewish schools? Did you get involved in Jewish life in your area?
I went to both Christian and Jewish schools. And at the Christian schools, I was young enough that nobody noticed. And then being at a Jewish school, again, it was the same of no one noticing because everyone was Jewish.
Right.
Okay.
So Christian primary school and then a Jewish secondary school.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're used to being in a Jewish area, in a Jewish environment, being surrounded by lots of Jewish people.
Yeah.
Okay, so what made you choose UWE, which is very different to that?
I just wanted to venture outside of the comfort of my usual social circles, and meet different people from different places instead of going where a lot of my friends were going. Yeah. Sure.
And what were your expectations of UWE as a Jewish 18, 19-year-old? What were your expectations?
I expected there would be a few other Jewish students, and there would be, and I also expected that any instance of anti-Semitism would be treated with the same severity that anyone would treat anti-Black racism or Islamophobia or homophobia. So I wasn't expecting to meet that many other people who were Jewish. Okay,
and since you've arrived, has that happened? Have you met any of the other Jewish people?
I've met one or two other Jewish people, but one of them wasn't comfortable being out as Jewish, and that was the first time I've come across that where someone doesn't feel comfortable, which I often hear about in history happening, but I haven't really seen it in person today.
Okay, so you met a Jewish student who wasn't comfortable sharing that he or she was Jewish. Okay, so maybe we should just explore that a bit. So I'll talk now a little bit about my background. I grew up in Shropshire in the middle of nowhere. we were the only Jews in the village, no Jews for miles around. But actually, 2 generations of my family tried to hide their Jewishness because they wanted to avoid persecution. That didn't really work, but that was the idea. And lots of Jewish people over the centuries have tried to hide their Jewishness. And you met someone at UWE who, you know, also tried to sort of keep it, under wraps. Yeah. Okay. What's it been like for you moving from that very, you know, sort of Jewish environment to a very non-Jewish environment and being in a minority? How have you found that?
I didn't mind being the only Jewish person around, but it did bother me that there was, I think I was quite unprepared for like the amount of misinformation and even ignorance that a lot of other people believed about Jews when they met me. And the more I thought about it, the more it made sense, because if you haven't met a Jewish person before, all you really have to go off are like what's in media or stereotypes, and you have no reason to think of them as untrue. So for example, I've been asked if it's true. I've been asked if it's true that I love spending money, and I've also been asked that if it's true that I love not spending money, both relating to various Jewish stereotypes about having enough money to spend on anything and everything, but also not wanting to spend any money.
Yeah. Okay.
So these are conflicting stereotypes, but they're still stereotypes.
Yeah, absolutely. So the stereotype that Jews, on the one hand, have lots of money, but on the other hand, are very mean with it. So, you know, these very old ideas. Think English literature. Think Fagin. Think Shylock. These ideas sort of run through history. Okay. Any other sort of experiences like that?
Well, I've been in a seminar where we were looking at the mugging of a Holocaust survivor, and a student in the room started explaining how it was actually really fun summer camps, and they weren't joking. And Holocaust denial is an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that claims that either Nazis didn't kill Jews or as many Jewish people as were reported, and implies that we're lying about our history for supposed gain in the present of some kind. And it's also extremely disrespectful and hurtful to the 6 million Jews who were killed, and their descendants who are still alive today. Okay,
so you're in a seminar where someone says the Holocaust comes up, and someone says the Holocaust was just a series of summer camps, so they're effectively denying the mass murder of 6 million Jews. And so this was a seminar, and just tell us who said that, Harry?
It was another student.
Okay, and what happened next?
The seminar leader probably didn't know how to react, as I didn't either, because it was the first time I'd come across someone with views like that. So they just brushed it to the side by changing the subject and saying, let's not get too political.
Okay, and then carried on with the seminar. Okay,
yeah.
I've been in seminars where things have come up which I've not really expected, and I've probably dealt with them in the same way. Was it followed up afterwards?
Not immediately afterwards. It was followed up a couple of years later, and now the department has the infrastructure in place to deal with Holocaust denial. It's on their radar now, but it wasn't back then.
Okay, so you raised it, and then the head of department circulated guidance about how to address it should it happen again.
Yeah.
Okay, so that sounds like an example of good practice, responding well to something that that came up. Any other experiences you'd like to share, either positive or negative?
Yeah. I've been told that Jews aren't big enough a minority to be made dealing with a priority. I've sadly been in group conversations where Jews have been blamed for the result of the 2019 UK general election, because where like things were said like Jews didn't like Corbyn because apparently they're being bribed by the Nazis and the Tory party. Yeah. And also just general ignorance from other students and even staff that borders with or crosses into anti-Semitism. Often it's ignorance rather than maliciousness. And a lot of time people don't understand the difference between Jewish, Israeli citizen, and Israeli government.
Okay,
They just group us all together.
Yeah, so Jews here in Britain, a lot of us will have family in Israel. For a lot of us, Israel is important. But for chance, my ancestors fleeing persecution in Eastern Europe might have ended up in Israel rather than in Britain. Okay, they didn't, but they might have done. So Israel is important for us, but we're not Israeli citizens. We don't have the right to vote in Israeli elections. We don't have any influence over what happens over there. So, Jews, Israel, the Israeli government, different categories. While we're thinking about Israel, obviously over the last few weeks, there has been fighting in the Middle East between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. I don't particularly want to get into the ins and outs of what's happening over there, but how has it felt over here for you, Harry, as a British Jew here at UWE?
It's been really scary seeing the social media response and how people's opinions are influenced by that. Because suddenly everyone has an opinion on this, when most of them don't understand the full situation. They just think it's another Black Lives Matter, Me Too moment where everyone's sharing information about what's going on to raise awareness. I've seen BBC and CNN reporters in the last few weeks, and even blue-tick celebrities on Twitter, tweet that Hitler was right and left some Jews alive so the world can understand why he killed so many. The rhetoric being used a lot is the genocide, apartheid, ethnic cleansing, which is inaccurate and incites hate around the world towards Jews from people who can't understand the difference between Jewish and Israeli. And it's important to note that legitimate criticism of the Israeli government is completely fine and allowed, as long as it is anything that any other government could be criticized of. But criticism of those few things specifically, it does nothing good to help anyone. I've seen people driving near where I live at home, yelling into the streets to sexually assault Jewish mothers and daughters in the name of saving Palestine. This is one of hundreds of anti-Semitic incidents in the last month. I've had family members as young as 18 years old confiding in the last few weeks that they don't see a future for British Jews in this country or even in Europe. I've been called a Nazi apologist by another student because I said I believed in a peaceful outcome. Yeah, that's it's important to understand the difference between legitimate criticism, anti-Semitic criticism, and then the difference between that, the government and Israeli citizens and British Jews, or just Jews around the world.
Sure.
Because you should only ever really be criticising the government, not the others.
Absolutely, yeah. So, yeah, I'll repeat what I said a few moments ago. I'm 44. I've lived in England nearly all my life, and this is the first time over the last few weeks where I've felt slightly scared. And I've seen on social media, perhaps if you're watching, you have two clips of cars driving through North London, through Jewish areas in North London, waving Palestinian flags and shouting very loudly, F the Jews, rape their daughters, and so on. And that's quite scary, particularly when police are so slow to respond. So, this is these are quite anxious times for British Jews. Harry, I'll ask you the same question I asked Poppy to finish off. What is the one thing you would like people who are listening to this to take away?
Not to necessarily believe something shared about Jews because it's on TV or the internet, and that anti-Semitism exists on both sides of the political spectrum.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. I think it's a really important point, something I highlighted at the start. We generally think of anti-Semitism as coming from the right, the far right, we think of the Nazis, but actually there are left-wing variants, there are variants from the centre, and there are variants from outside politics. Okay, Harry, thank you very much. I'm going to share the slides again, at least I hope I am, and then we'll just finish off with some resources. So Harry, thank you very much. So we've heard from Harry and Poppy. I hope that was helpful and insightful and enlightening. Just as we finish off, a few practical steps and resources. So both Harry and Poppy, I think, said this. Don't assume there are no Jewish students in your classes. There may well be. There may be people who are Jewish. There might be some people who aren't comfortable saying that. Don't assume there are no Jewish students in your classes. Think about anti-Semitism in the same way you would about racism or about prejudice towards any other minority. Some minorities are visible, some aren't. Often Jewish people aren't visible, but we are nonetheless a minority. Couple of acronyms: BAME, Black and Minority Ethnic, or the American, I think, term, BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, People of Colour. Where do Jews fit into that? Where do Jewish students fit? Worth thinking about. If you're someone who draws up or looks at reading lists and toolkits on equality, diversity and inclusion, do they include resources on anti-Semitism? Experts on other forms of racism may not necessarily be experts on anti-Semitism because it does often work differently. If you're someone who talks or writes about Israel, avoid anti-Semitic themes as you do so. If you're someone who thinks about decolonizing the curriculum, just be aware that many dead white Europeans are in fact from an ethnic minority. So Freud and Einstein, to take two obvious examples, were actually Jewish. So that's worth thinking about. Just as we finish, here are a list of resources. I put a whole list of resources, combination of books, videos, articles, other resources. Some of them contain swear words. If you're going to access just one of them, get hold of David Baddiel's book. It's very short. It will only take you a couple of hours to read. And he really does, I think, bring out very well this question of why, when we think about tackling racism and prejudice, maybe we don't think about Jews or anti-Semitism in the same way as we think about other forms of racism. So thanks very much for watching. I hope it's been useful. Do feel free to email me if you have any questions. Thank you very much.